Can the human heart truly distinguish between justice and vengeance when years of unspeakable suffering finally erupt? What happens when the architect of unimaginable terror, a man who once held an entire continent in his iron grip, finds his own world violently collapsing around him, leaving him trembling in the dark? It was April 1945. The colossal, iron-fisted grip that once squeezed the life from nations across Europe was now slipping, utterly dissolving around the very man who wielded it. The world, which had once cowered in terror before the unstoppable might of Hitler's armies, was now mercilessly collapsing upon him, the self-proclaimed demigod who once commanded grand stages, his voice echoing with promises of 1,000-year Reich, now scurried and cowered, a pathetic, trembling figure, deep underground. His sanctuary, a damp, oppressive concrete bunker buried beneath the pulverized, smoking ruins of Berlin, his grand capital reduced to a graveyard. For endless, delusional years, he had meticulously cultivated and lived by a potent, self-serving myth of an unyielding destiny. Every crushing defeat, every devastating setback, every strategic blunder was summarily dismissed as a mere temporary inconvenience, a fleeting blip on the path to inevitable triumph. The Führer's will is unbreakable, his sycophantic ministers had tirelessly assured a terrified populace. But in the chilling, suffocating truth of that moment, his will, like the walls of his bunker, was already fractured, utterly broken beyond repair. Above him, a once proud Berlin was consumed by an inferno, its very soul burning. The relentless Soviet Red Army, a tide of vengeance, was mere miles away, their artillery shells thundering through the pulverized cityscape, each explosion a hammer blow against his crumbling empire. Inside the claustrophobic confines of the Führer bunker, no natural light dared to penetrate, only the sickly, flickering glow of dying electric lamps, the acrid, suffocating scent of stale cigarette smoke, and the palpable, nauseating stench of pure, unadulterated fear. Maps, meticulously emblazoned with grand, sweeping red arrows, still clung defiantly to the grimy concrete walls, depicting magnificent, imaginary counterattacks that would, in the cruel reality of the moment, never materialize, fading into the realm of desperate fantasy. Hitler, clinging to a final, desperate delusion of control, vehemently refused to leave. His terrified, desperate generals, their faces etched with despair, pleaded with him, begging him to escape to the strategic redoubt of the Bavarian Alps, to regroup, to fight another day. But he merely met their desperate pleas with a hollow, disbelieving laugh, a sound devoid of mirth, chillingly detached. Surrender. Never, he spat, his voice laced with venom. I will not run like a coward, a pathetic worm. To him, the very concept of retreat, of strategic withdrawal, was tantamount to the ultimate humiliation, a wound to his unshakable self-image. Death, he truly believed, was infinitely preferable to the unbearable shame of defeat. Yet behind those cold, piercing blue eyes, once burning with an almost hypnotic fanaticism, something profound, something terrifyingly human, had undeniably shifted. For the very first time in his meticulously constructed, power-hungry life, Adolf Hitler, the architect of a continent's suffering, began to grasp the horrifying, inescapable realization that his entire world, his meticulously crafted empire, his iron-fisted control, his carefully nurtured myth of invincibility, all of it, was irrevocably gone, dissolved like smoke in the inferno above. The first, ominous crack in his impregnable fortress of delusion appeared not from the roar of Soviet artillery, but from a whisper of betrayal within his own inner sanctum. Hermann Göring, his once obsequious, utterly loyal deputy, dispatched a message, a seemingly practical suggestion that he, Göring, should assume command of Germany if Hitler found himself irrevocably cut off in the inferno of Berlin. To any leader possessing even a shred of sanity, it would have been a pragmatic, even necessary contingency plan. To Hitler, however, consumed by paranoia and a pathological need for absolute control, it was an unforgivable act of treachery, a dagger plunged into his back. He exploded in an incandescent, frothing rage, his voice a guttural scream, denouncing Göring as a vile traitor and immediately ordering his arrest, his fury echoing through the bunker's stifling air. But deep within the recesses of his tormented mind, a terrifying truth began to pierce through his delusions. Even his most devoted inner circle, Those who had once hung on his every word had finally ceased to believe in his impossible victory. By this desperate juncture, every single major city across Germany lay in smoking ruins, its infrastructure pulverized, its people desperate. The relentless Western allies were closing in from one side, a tide of retribution, while the vengeful Soviets pressed in from the other, a relentless wave of destruction. The once invincible Third Reich was now a skeletal shadow, utterly surrounded, its populace starving, its territories tragically divided. Yet, with a horrifying tenacity, Hitler still clung to his fading illusions like a drowning man to a splintered plank. He fervently believed that the mythical Steiner counterattack, a final, desperate stand supposedly led by the valiant General Felix Steiner, would miraculously crush the Soviet onslaught and miraculously save his besieged Berlin. But Steiner, starved of men and mad real, a phantom general leading phantom troops, never received the necessary forces, never launched the impossible attack. It was an order born not from strategic genius, but from the fevered, desperate fantasies of a mind spiraling into madness. When his trembling staff, their faces ashen, finally informed him that Steiner had utterly failed to move, that the phantom attack would not materialize, something inside Hitler irrevocably snapped. Witnesses, their eyes wide with fear, later described him shaking violently, uncontrollably, his entire body convulsing. He slammed his fists repeatedly against the cold, unforgiving table, his screams tearing through the bunker, shrieking that the war was irrevocably lost, that everyone had betrayed him, forsaken him in his hour of greatest need. It was the infamous bunker meltdown, a terrifying, visceral explosion of impotent rage. This was the raw, brutal moment of truth that even his most loyal, most fanatical officers would carry with them to their graves, an image seared forever into their minds. It was when the last fragile remnants of his illusion, the carefully constructed facade of an unbreakable will, shattered completely, falling like shattered glass. For the very first time, Adolf Hitler uttered the chilling, unthinkable words that his men, in their wildest nightmares, never believed they would hear if the war is lost. He abruptly, violently, dismissed everyone from the room, needing to confront his shattered reality alone. When they hesitantly returned, his voice had lost its thunderous command, becoming a quiet, spectral whisper. His face was pale, utterly drained of life, almost ghostly in the dim light. He no longer invoked the grand, intoxicating prophecies of victory, or destiny, or eternal glory. His words, chillingly, spoke only of death. He informed them, with an unnerving calm, that he would remain in Berlin, amidst the ruins of his creation, and put a bullet through his own head when the appointed time arrived. The man who had once dominated and terrorized an entire continent with a single, absolute order now sat trembling in the suffocating shadows, his gaze fixed blankly on the grimy floor, a puppet whose strings had been cut. Even the stale, recycled air in the bunker seemed to press down with an oppressive weight, as if everyone could viscerally feel the crushing burden of history, inexorably closing in around them. Outside, the terrifying symphony of battle grew louder, closer, more desperate. The guttural rumble of Soviet tanks, the relentless, bone-shaking pounding of artillery, each sound was a stark reminder of his impending doom. The Red Army, a relentless tide of vengeful soldiers, had already breached the city center. Berlin, once the proud capital of his monstrous empire, was now a desolate, burning sea of fire, its streets choked with the smoke of its own demise, filled with terrified civilians desperately fleeing through the endless rubble. Officers, their faces grim, frantically burned incriminating documents, while mere boys, still too young to shave, were tragically sent to defend crumbling streets that no longer functionally existed, sacrificing their lives for a phantom city. Hitler's world, the meticulously constructed edifice of fear, deceit, and iron-fisted cruelty, was dissolving around him with a speed and ferocity he simply would not, comprehend. But he wasn't merely losing a war, he was losing his very identity, the elaborate, godlike image he had so carefully constructed in his own twisted mind. For years, his pervasive propaganda had relentlessly hammered home the message to the German people that he was a man chosen by an immutable fate, a divine instrument of destiny. Now, As the very walls of his concrete bunker violently shook with each deafening explosion above, even he, the self-proclaimed Messiah, began to wonder with a chilling tremor of doubt if fate itself had finally abandoned him, casting him adrift in the wreckage of his ambitions. In the quiet corner of his cluttered desk, he kept a meticulously framed portrait of Frederick the Great, the legendary Prussian king, a man who, centuries earlier, had famously snatched victory from the very jaws of near defeat. Hitler stared at it often, his gaze desperate, as if waiting for a miracle, a divine intervention that would replicate that ancient triumph. But none came. By mid-April, the grim reports flowed in like poison. His closest, most trusted allies were irrevocably gone, their loyalty dissolving like smoke. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, was secretly, frantically negotiating with the Western Allies, a desperate betrayal. Joseph Goebbels, his chief propagandist, was collapsing emotionally, his once powerful voice reduced to whimpers. And Hitler's once powerful, revered generals were either dead, captured, or desperately fleeing, abandoning their posts, leaving him utterly alone. The man who had once commanded millions of souls, whose every word could ignite a continent, now ruled over a pitiful handful of terrified staff and secretaries, trembling in fear, locked deep underground in a self-made tomb, a monument to his own hubris. And then came the final, crushing blow, the ultimate realization of his demise. News arrived, whispered from the shattered remnants of his communication network, that the relentless Soviets were within mere blocks of the Reich Chancellery, the very seat of his power. The thunderous, relentless roar of artillery echoed through the endless night, each boom a tolling bell of his approaching end. The end was no longer a vague rumor, a distant threat. It was the chilling, unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps directly above him. He knew then, with a terrifying clarity, that there would be no escape, no miraculous victory, no redemption, only an inevitable, brutal ending. But the precise, agonizing moment he truly realized it was all irrevocably over wasn't during a chaotic meeting or in the frantic analysis of a battle map. It happened in the profound, suffocating silence of his private despair. It was when he walked into his personal quarters, the heavy, reinforced door clanging shut behind him, sealing him off from the dying world. He looked into the cold, unforgiving mirror, and there, staring back at him, was not the all-powerful Führer, not the self-proclaimed conqueror of Europe, but an old, pathetic, utterly broken man, his eyes hollow, waiting only for death. The mirror, an unyielding judge, stared back, reflecting pale, sallow skin, trembling, nerveless hands, and eyes no longer burning with fanatical fury, but filled with a vast, terrifying emptiness. Adolf Hitler, the monstrous architect who had once so grandly promised a new, terrifying world order, now resembled nothing more than the emaciated, pathetic ghost of his own destructive creation. He knew the inevitable end was rapidly approaching, but in his final, desperate act of control, he wanted to choreograph it, to meticulously script his own demise, just as he had once dictated the fates of entire nations. If he could not win the war, he would, by God, at least decide how it would end. He issued chilling orders to his dwindling staff, burn every single record, every document, every scrap of paper that might, in some future age, humiliate him or expose his weaknesses. He gave precise, macabre instructions that his body be utterly destroyed after death, reduced to unrecognizable ash. He harbored a profound, almost pathological fear of being displayed publicly like his Italian counterpart, Mussolini, his lifeless form hung upside down for the entire world to gawk at, to mock. Even in his final, desperate hours, a grotesque, all-consuming vanity dictated his actions more powerfully than any flicker of humanity. Outside the steel walls of his tomb, the relentless Red Army was storming Berlin, street by bloody street, block by pulverized block. The once proud, majestic German capital had been transformed into an apocalyptic wasteland, a landscape of skeletal buildings, their insides gutted, a perpetual shroud of black smoke suffocating the sky. The terrifying, guttural sounds of advancing tanks and the searing hiss of flamethrowers echoed eerily through the endless ruins. A symphony of destruction. Hitler, trapped in his subterranean coffin, could hear it all, every single explosion, every distant shot. Each reverberating blast felt like another agonizing heartbeat of his dying empire, fading into nothingness. Inside the bunker, the last meager scraps of food were nearly gone. The vital water pressure had failed, plunging parts of the vast complex into darkness, its electricity gone. Secretaries wept quietly through the long, terrifying nights, some choosing the swift, certain release of cyanide capsules rather than face the unthinkable shame and terror of capture. Even his loyal German shepherd Blondie, a symbol of domesticity, became a pawn in his chilling, spiraling delusion. He heartlessly tested the poison on her, ensuring its efficacy, her innocent life a mere means to an end. That was the monstrous kind of man he had become, and a tyrannical ruler so utterly consumed by pathological fear, by a desperate need for control, that he trusted the cold embrace of death more implicitly than any human loyalty. By April 29th, the crackling radio brought him the final, soul-crushing humiliation. Benito Mussolini, his once closest ally, his mirroring reflection in Italy, had been captured, publicly executed by his own enraged people, his body mutilated, desecrated, and hung for all the world to see, a stark warning. Hitler stared at the grim report for a long, agonizing time, his face devoid of emotion, a mask of stone. He said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a dry, raspy sound, he muttered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." That was the precise, chilling moment he fully accepted death, not as a final, humiliating defeat, but as his ultimate, meticulously planned act of control. He, and only he, would decide when the Third Reich truly ended. That night, in a grotesque parody of normal life amidst the apocalypse, he married Eva Braun, his longtime mistress. It was not a wedding born of love, but a macabre ritual, a final, desperate illusion of normalcy enacted before the complete, inevitable collapse. They toasted with cheap, ersatz champagne, its bubbles flat, as the relentless Soviet artillery violently shook the very foundations of the bunker above them. Witnesses described him as strangely, unnervingly calm, almost polite, distant, even, in some fleeting moments, gentle. It was as if the internal storm that had raged within him for decades had finally, silently dissipated, leaving behind a terrifying, empty calm. But outside that small candlelit room, flickering with a false sense of peace, everything was irrevocably over. The Red Army had already breached the very heart of the government district. The terrifying staccato of gunfire echoed incessantly from directly above. Soldiers of the Reich, shattered and broken, were either meekly surrendering or dying in the burning streets, their sacrifice futile. There was no army left to save him, no formidable fortress left to defend him, only a damp, suffocating bunker buried deep beneath the ruins of a city that no longer truly existed. When his terrified, desperate aides finally entered the room, they found him slumped motionless on the couch, a pistol still clutched in his nerveless hand. Eva Braun lay beside him, her face serene in death, a faint, acrid smell of cyanide clinging to the air. The man who had so casually, so ruthlessly, demanded that millions perish for his insane vision could not, in the end, face defeat himself. His loyal, remaining guards carried the two bodies upstairs, out into the grim, open-air garden, and burned them under the gray, indifferent Berlin sky, precisely as he had ordered, a final, desperate attempt to erase his physical presence. Above them, the incessant, destructive rain of Soviet shells continued to fall, burying the remnants of his legacy. The empire that had once arrogantly stretched from the vast, churning Atlantic to the mighty, ancient Volga ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, reduced to a few feet of anonymous, wind-swept ash. When Soviet troops, their faces grim, finally breached the hidden entrance to the Her bunker days later, they discovered a scene frozen in a tableau of macabre decay, a haunting testament to desperation and madness. Maps lay scattered across grimy tables, half-eaten food moldered in discarded plates, and desperate, frantic notes were scribbled erratically on the concrete walls. Desperate pleas from men on the edge. Everything within that subterranean tomb smelled perpetually of acrid smoke, stale sweat, and an omnipresent, suffocating fear. In the very room where Hitler had taken his final, cowardly breath, the air seemed to cling, heavy and oppressive, as if history itself, stunned by the horror, stubbornly refused to move on. His remaining guards, their faces streaked with soot and despair, surrendered soon after. Berlin, the once proud capital, finally fell completely on May 2nd. Within a week, Nazi Germany, the monstrous 1,000-year Reich, was utterly gone, extinguished like a guttering candle. It had lasted a mere 12 brutal years. But the chilling, complex story did not simply end there. In the tumultuous months that followed, wild, desperate rumors spread like wildfire across a traumatized Europe, that Hitler had somehow miraculously escaped, that he was alive, lurking somewhere in the shadowy, distant reaches of South America. For many Germans utterly shattered by defeat and the horrifying revelations of Nazi atrocities, it was inexplicably easier to cling to such a fantastical delusion than to confront the brutal, dehumanizing truth, the truth that their Führer, their supposed savior, had utterly abandoned them, just as he had irrevocably abandoned reality itself, long before the bitter end. Because the real, pivotal moment Adolf Hitler truly lost the war wasn't in that damp, suffocating bunker. It wasn't when the triumphant Allies streamed across the Rhine, or when the vengeful Soviets finally seized Berlin. No, it was years earlier, in a quiet, insidious moment, the instant he began to believe, with unshakable conviction, that he was utterly infallible, that destiny, his personal God, could never ever betray him. The bunker, in its final agonizing hours, was merely the silent, grim stage where that colossal illusion finally, irrevocably died. As Berlin burned, its ashes raining down on a continent in ruins, millions of lives across Europe were left utterly shattered, forever broken by the inferno. Families were torn apart, their bonds irrevocably severed. Ancient, magnificent cities were erased from the map, their histories reduced to rubble. Generations were scarred, their souls traumatized, by a legacy of unspeakable evil. And for what ultimate purpose? For the monstrous delusion of a single, megalomaniacal man who arrogantly thought himself greater than truth itself, greater than humanity, greater than God. In the final, sobering judgment of history, Hitler is not remembered for his vast, blood-soaked empire or his mesmerizing, hateful speeches. He is remembered profoundly for the terrifying silence that followed his reign. The deafening silence of a proud city in ruins. The chilling silence of a concrete bunker, buried deep underground. And the profound, agonizing silence of a man who finally, in his last, desperate moments, realized with terrifying clarity that the monstrous world he had so meticulously built from the raw material of hate could never, would never, outlive him. The Third Reich, a nightmare made real, did not end with a grand, climactic battle or a heroic, defiant last stand. It ended with a single, pathetic gunshot, echoing weakly through the suffocating darkness of a subterranean tomb, marking the ignominious fall of a dictator who, until his very last breath, foolishly believed he could rewrite the immutable hand of fate. And in that precise, chilling moment, a traumatized world, holding its breath for years, finally exhaled a collective sigh of profound relief, because, at long last, the nightmare was unequivocally over.